So there's this story that I love that I want to tell you about some people who are trying to cover up a murder. They're trying to cover up a murder and their cover-up keeps failing. So it's kind of like a murder mystery. Who lives outside the law and outside the walls of the city? He's suspected of heresy. He hasn't bathed and his hair is long and greasy and he's lost weight. And Thomas is horrified that this is what religious devotion has brought Johann to. But Johann says he's not a heretic. And then one night he wakes up to find a pamphlet under his door. It's one of Johann's pamphlets. But how could that be? Let me explain why. If you like this podcast and you want to support it, please consider supporting it. There's this idea that when you destroy evidence of a crime, you've covered your ass. But obviously you haven't, because you're still being haunted by the crime. You're still being haunted by the ghost of the person you killed. And so your cover-up keeps failing, even though you thought you were clever enough to cover it up. And also, the pamphlets. Right? Like the whole point of the story is that the pamphlets live on, even though Thomas destroys them. And there's something so exciting about that as a reader, as someone hearing this story. Because I think we all want to believe that ideas can't be killed. Like just because you kill someone, just because you destroy evidence, just because you destroy a book, that doesn't mean that the idea dies. The idea can spread and grow and change. And that's kind of comforting and also terrifying. And that's why I think stories like this live on. Thomas destroyed them all. Well, he didn't destroy them all. As it turns out, he only destroyed the ones he read. The ones he didn't read survived, and one of those was in the lining of his own Bible. He never would have found it unless it fell apart. And in the end, he realizes that Johann was right, that the church is corrupt and greedy, and he ends the story by saying that Johann was a martyr. Even though he doesn't know what happened to him, he's an innocent man who is being framed. And so he tries to convince Thomas to take the pamphlets to the bishop. But Thomas doesn't want to get involved. And Johann goes away again and Thomas destroys the pamphlets. Basically, when Thomas gets to John's house, John isn't there. But Thomas finds a bunch of pamphlets written by John arguing that the church has gotten greedy and corrupt. Thomas is both frightened and intrigued by these pamphlets, especially because he recognizes some of the handwriting from his own religious studies. So he hides the pamphlets and then waits around for Johann to come home. And eventually he does. Yes, this is the most basic summary of the plot of Clue. Anyway, these people think that they can fool everyone else. And I think they're fooling everyone else except for the person narrating the story. This is a story about lying and ink and fire. It is called The Inquisitor's Tale or The 39 Steps, depending on which adaptation you prefer. The narrator is a young monk named Brother Thomas, and one day he's sent to deliver a message to a priest named Johann, and Johann is kind of a mess. But then the next day, soldiers show up looking for Johann. They tell Thomas that Johann is a heretic and that Thomas has given them quite a lot of information. And now they're coming with him back to the city. And Thomas panics because he realizes that he doesn't actually know anything about what's going on. He doesn't know whether Johann is a heretic or not. All he knows is that he himself is in very deep trouble. And so he flees, wandering the countryside for months, surviving on charity until he finds a new home in a monastery. Years pass and Thomas becomes a respected monk, but he's haunted by nightmares of the soldiers searching for him. Okay? I love this story. Thank you for listening. Years turned like rotting pages. The bishop's death was sudden. He collapsed mid-sermon. His likeness, never painted in life, began appearing in etchings, always with hollow eyes and lips slightly parted, as though caught mid-sentence. Revolutionary thinkers quoted his phrases, attributing them to the boiled ghost of Munster. Some even claimed to have dreamt of him, standing beside their beds, whispering truths too dangerous to write. And then there was the dream of Volker Mays, a minor historian who unearthed the bishop's private journal in 1784. In it, a single entry uncharacteristically short stood out. It read, "I see him in the oil. He speaks without a tongue." Me, obsessed, traced every known copy of John's work. Believing they contained hidden messages in 1792, he vanished. His study, locked from the inside, was found splattered with black ink. On the wall, scratched with fingernails, were the words, "Truth burns slowest." To this day, no one knows where John was buried, if he was buried at all. But the town square of Munster remains oddly cold, even in midsummer. Children say the cobblestones hum if you press your ear to them, as if something beneath is still stirring. A pulse, a voice. Every century demands its truth teller. Some are exiled, some are erased, and some are boiled alive, but none are truly silenced, because ink, you see, remembers, eyes wide and mouth agape, as if someone had whispered a secret too dreadful to bear. No physician could explain the expression carved into his face, as if he had seen a ghost in the vaulted arches above. At his funeral, the incense barely masked the sour scent of fear. The congregation did not weep. They watched. After his passing, the city of Munster tried to forget. They paved over the dye house and built a grain store on its bones. They burned the remaining pamphlets. They forbade the mention of Johann Theodor, whose name had become ash on every tongue. But history is not so easily silenced. In the winter of 1603, nearly 50 years after John's execution, strange things began to unfold. A baker's apprentice uncovered a rusted iron plate beneath the grain store's foundation. On it were words etched in reverse, clearly the imprint from a press, though damaged. The line was unmistakable. The mouth may die, but the word endures. Soon after, printers across the Rhine began reproducing facsimiles of John's early works. No one knew who provided the originals. The ink was old but fresh to the eye, smelling faintly of smoke. Some believed Brother Lucas had hidden the plates before his death. Others whispered of a darker tale, that John's ghost returned each All Souls' Eve, pressing words into the living minds of the righteous. A magistrate in Cologne, fearing the resurgence of sedition, ordered all copies seized. Yet for every pamphlet destroyed, two more surfaced. One was nailed to the city's gallows, another found inside a bishop's tomb, folded into his skeletal hand. It was as if the ink had grown roots, burrowed deep into the soil of Europe's conscience, impossible to pluck out. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, Johann Theodor had become a myth, a martyr. In the forgotten lanes of 16th century Munster, there once walked a man whose name was whispered only when thunder rolled overhead, always draped in a long grey coat stained with ink smudges and ash. His fingers were perpetually blackened. He could have named names. There were plenty of men in this city who would have traded their own safety for a single glance of the bishop's favour. But Johann was a man of the press, of lead and ink, not of fear and favours. So he said nothing. He let the bishop break his body, thinking perhaps the man in the ornate robes would break with joy. But Franz von Waldeck had no such intention. For him, the dissenter's pain was not a soul, but a problem, something to be solved, dispatched with, silenced. So he chained Johann to the very press that had birthed these heretical pamphlets, and began to feed him through it, sheet by sheet, until it was filled with the gush of blood. The townspeople heard it that night, the quiet gush of life ebbing away from the man who had given voice to their discontent. They could not save him then, but they remembered the words he had put in their mouths, the truths he had set in their minds. And when morning came and they found Johann at the mouth of the press, pale as the parchment he had printed, they knew their revolution was only beginning. His blood soaked into the cobblestones, mingling with the river's rush, carrying down the centuries an echo of what was to come. The bishop thought he had silenced a voice, but he had birthed a roar. In the years that followed, the whispers about Johann grew louder, turning into cheers. For the people of Munster realized they weren't just fighting for bread and land. They were fighting for the right to speak, to question, to think. And that, like Johann's spirit, could never truly be broken, as if the words he printed had soaked through his skin, etched themselves into his bones. He had a soft voice and tired eyes, but when he spoke, people listened because he never wasted words. His pamphlets were different. They didn't flatter kings or parrot sermons. They asked questions, difficult ones, uncomfortable ones, the kind that unsettled men in velvet robes and gold rings. He never signed them, but everyone in Munster knew who was behind them. Why must the bishop live in marble halls while widows freeze in rags? One leaflet asked. If God grants forgiveness, why must we pay men to speak in his name? Asked another. The townsfolk would gather in corners of taverns, reading the smuggled texts in candlelight, their lips curling into cautious smirks. But those in power? They did not smirk. Bishop Franz von Waldeck, ruler of Munster and a man who wore his piety like armor, had long grown weary of the murmurs rising from below. To him, the city was a cathedral, every stone laid in obedience, every voice a hymn to order. Johann's words were not hymns, they were hammers, and hammers had no place in a cathedral. Johann Theodor, he was not a noble nor a clergyman but a printer, a man of ink and lead, of quiet thoughts and dangerously loud ideas. His workshop, tucked beneath the shadow of St. Lambert's bell tower, smelled of burning oil, but parchment and revolution. For Johann, the press was no mere tool. It was a weapon, and like all weapons, it would eventually turn on its wielder. Johann was a thin man. One rain-washed evening, a soldier named Mathis found a pamphlet pinned to the door of the bishop's residence. On it, scrawled in bold crimson ink, "If silence is holy, then why does truth scream in chains?" That same night, Johann disappeared from his workshop. The townspeople whispered of black hoods and bloodied staircases. They were wrong about the hoods. There were none. But the blood? That part was true. They took him not to a dungeon, but to the old dye house on the river's edge. The irony was bitter. A place once used for boiling cloth, now reawakened for flesh. The bishop did not want a public trial. He wanted a message. When Johann awoke, shackled and stripped, he found himself surrounded by the tools of his own making, iron presses, molten pots, and parchment torn to rags. The bishop stood over him, robes gleaming with embroidery that seemed to writhe in the torchlight. "Speak," the bishop commanded, "and your tongue will be your undoing." Johann looked up, blood crusting at his lips, and whispered, "So be it." He could have begged,